Good afternoon from New York City and welcome. My name is Regina. I am the coordinator of the Americas Dialogue on Education Policy at the Institute of Latin American Studies, or ILAS, at Columbia University. On behalf of ILAS, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the third of a series of book and paper presentations and discussions that we will be having this academic year. The book that will be presented today is Schools Under Suspicion, Progressive and Critical Sociology to Think Education for All. The original title of the book is in Spanish, La Escuela Bajo Sospecha, Sociología Progresista y Crítica para Pensar la Educación para Todos. And once again, we have interpreting. You can just click on the icon. Tenemos interpretación, pueden checar, dar clic en el icono abajo de su pantalla. So we will begin with a presentation of the book by author Emilio Tenti, followed by a discussion with professors Pablo Pineau and Regina Cortina. We will then have a Q&A session where you will be able to raise your hand and ask questions. Once again, this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to ILAS's YouTube and may be shared through its different communication channels. Now, please let me introduce you to Professor Emilio Tenti and Professors Pineau and Cortina. I will switch to Spanish now. Emilio Tenti. Emilio nació en Italia y es argentino naturalizado. Obtuvo un doctorado de universidad en la Fundación Nacional de Ciencias Políticas de París. Es profesor titular e investigador en la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional de la Argentina y profesor consulto de la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo en Mendoza, donde en la década de los años 70 ocupó el cargo de decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Emilio se desempeñó durante 30 años como investigador principal del CONICET y profesor titular de Sociología de la Educación en la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Residió y ejerció la docencia e investigación en Colombia, México y Francia. En este último país fue nombrado profesor de la Cátedra Simón Bolívar de la Sorbona. En México fue investigador en el Centro de Estudios Prospectivos de la Fundación Javier Barro Sierra, en la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional y en la UNAM. En Colombia fue jefe del Departamento de Administración y Planificación de la División de Educación de la Universidad del Valle en Cali. Fue consultor de UNICEF, UNESCO y OEI en Argentina. Y además del libro que presentamos hoy, ha publicado diversos libros y artículos en revistas académicas de América Latina. Ahora, Pablo Pineau es doctor en educación por la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Es profesor titular regular de la Cátedra de Historia de la Educación Argentina y Latinoamericana de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UBA y de la Escuela Nacional, ¿qué será? Superior, Pablo, número 2. Sí, gracias, ENS, Mariano Acosta de la Cava. Posee una amplia trayectoria en publicaciones nacionales y extranjeras como autor, coautor y director en temáticas de historia, teoría y política de la educación. Presenta una vasta experiencia en cursos de formación y capacitación docente y de posgrado en instituciones argentinas y extranjeras, así como en la dirección y participación en proyectos de investigación. Pablo ocupó la presidencia de la Sociedad Argentina de Historia de la Educación y la dirección del Departamento de Ciencias de la Educación de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UBA. Ha obtenido la beca Tinker como profesor invitado al Teachers College de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York. Y como se dice en inglés, last but not least, Regina Cortina. Regina es profesora en la Escuela de Educación, Teachers College, en la Universidad de Columbia, en la ciudad de Nueva York. Es egresada de la Universidad de Stanford, donde estudió la maestría y el doctorado en educación. También es expresidenta de la Comparative and International Education Society durante 2019 y 2020, fue presidenta. Entre sus publicaciones recientes se encuentran La pasión por lo posible en educación comparada e internacional, que se publicó en la Comparative Education Review en 2019. El trabajo de Regina como profesora e investigadora está contribuyendo al campo al enfocarse en las teorías decoloniales en la educación comparada. Dos de sus artículos más recientes se publicaron en 2019 y 2020 en Compare, The Journal of Comparative and International Education. El libro más reciente de Regina Cortina, Indigenous Education Policy, Equity, An Intercultural Understanding in Latin America, salió en 2017. Y ahora pues le doy la palabra a Emilio Tenti, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Romina. Bueno, es un gusto.
Much, Romina. It is definitely a privilege to be here in such great company. It's a privilege to be able to present this book among friends and colleagues at Columbia University, and of course from other institutions. I know that many friends are participating on this call, so I feel very comfortable with this. And as Mexicans say, the very first thing I'd like to do, I would like to first publicly thank Dr. Regina Cortina twice, a friend of mine whom I've known for many years, twice because, of course, for her institutional invitation. She took the initiative of presenting my book within the framework of Columbia University, and of course, the comments that she will probably make about my presentation. I'm also very pleased to be collaborating with my distinguished and esteemed Argentine colleague, Dr. Pablo Pineau, and I thank him for joining me during this presentation. And of course, I'm sure that his observations will be very pertinent to what we will be talking about today and continue reflecting on these topics that constitute the corpus of this book. First, I would like to clear up, of course, why are we talking about school under suspicion? Because I believe that the majority of the societies and regions, in fact, in many areas of developed countries, this is an old institution of the capitalist state that we call school or school system, which once had an almost sacred character, is today under suspicion and is the object of criticism and reform. Proof of is the fact that for at least 3 decades, the evaluating school has been transformed into an evaluated school at the national and international level. The widespread institutionalization of systems and programs for evaluating the quality of education is proof that the school, its practices, agents, and products are under suspicion. The examining school has become, in fact, the examined school. So, of course, now let's look at this closely. But not all base suspicion and criticism in the same way. The only thing that shows some coincidence is the fact that most observers note a gap between the growing and often contradictory expectations placed on the school system and its practical achievements. But of course, sometimes this is of course something that we consider very important. But behind this consensus, there are various ways of interpreting and explaining this phenomenon, from which various reform and renewal strategies are derived, political ones at that. So schematically, and of course, I talk more about this in the book, let us say that while some explain the educational problem as the result of a structural inability of the state to provide efficient public services, others believe that the explanation is more complex and has its roots in the economic, political, and social history of our societies. So, what are some of the topics that make up this book? What I'd like to say is that these are old topics, of course, that of course have interested me for a very long time and have accompanied me throughout my entire career in the field of discussion and research on school education, even when I began in Mexico, where I studied fiercely about and was involved in educational debate and research up until the last few years. These are problems that are like obsessions that do not leave me and about which I feel compelled to return to the extent that for me, they never have a satisfactory solution. In the first place, I must confess that in almost all my academic career, I have been inspired by a kind of dissatisfaction with certain typical characteristics that the field of the so-called educational sciences has. Especially its low relative autonomy in the relation to the field of educational policy and politics in general, business corporations, interests linked to private education, providers such as churches, banks, et cetera, et cetera. The low propensity, something that also worries me, of course, as a deficit in this field of the production problems from the field of educational policy is the lack of dialogue among these. What we have are a tendency for parallel monologues. And of course, perhaps this is a thing that this is why we have specialists that participate in several traditions. We come from different disciplines, which makes the dialogue more difficult, right? Our languages are different. These and other issues. Something else that makes me, or that I obsess over, we have the schemes and oppositions of the type of traditional pedagogy in modern pedagogies: reproduction or change, conservative or revolutionary theories, subjectivist or deterministic, student-centered or knowledge-centered, theories centered on learning versus teaching, neoliberal theories and populist theories, and others that are similar, whose very method of approach makes it difficult to overcome it or its dialectical articulation. Second, the themes I develop that are not new, of course. In the book, I dedicated two chapters, I would say, to return to the issue of school education as a matter of state. Moreover, school systems among capitalist countries, and of course, Pablo Pineau knows this better than I do. He is a very well-known specialist in Argentina and Latin America. These school systems are an initiative of incipient modern nation states, and as such are an obligation rather than a right. You know, they're a right more so than they're an obligation more so than a right. School systems in most of Latin America nation states were an initiative from its very origin, an obligation. These were not a result of people that were illiterate. This was an imposition of the state. Even today, basic education, which is the one that interests me the most, and research, continues to be an obligation. And this, of course, was a result of the liberal state. This was not a result of private initiative or social demand or the churches. Here, I take this opportunity to recall that during my stay in Mexico, I had the opportunity to carry out and publish a socio-historical research on the genesis of the Mexican educational state, especially from the restored republic. Well, I was talking with my colleagues recently that the publisher added the title that I did not want to add, that's a little bit disorienting to the reader or to the consumer, of course. The book is called The Art of the Good Teacher. There was a first edition in 1988, and then it was republished in 1999. And I believe that there's another edition of this that the publisher, of course, hasn't even informed me about. But let's say, during that stage, foundational stage, there are several ideas that are talked. There are several debates that are explored between intervention in school systems is a matter of permanent debate, which involves civil society, churches, but it's a permanent debate. And of course, I've tried to create some sort of synthesis between the different themes that are found. For this reason, I guess I would have to talk a little bit about the division of labor, which is, of course, being redefined constantly. In my book, I say that the state, at least for capitalistic societies that are developed, is not natural or not an instrument of the dominant classes or a place that expresses itself and represents the general interest, but its effects, real ones, can be located closer to the pole of the collective, right, of the general, or closer to the corporate in all of its interests. All of this depends on the relations of force that are established between political actors in certain historical and social contexts. So this is not an issue of theory, but it's an issue of research, empiric research. In fact, even at the same time, certain public policies may be aimed at satisfying the general interest, while others are subordinated to the interests of the dominant classes. So, a wonderful sociologist, which is a source of interest to me, he would say that the state has two hands, the left and the right. And this, of course, was published by the by a bunch of colleagues that talked about the left hand of the government, which talks about those policies to distribute resources for the different ministries, for health, education. Those are the ministries that spend money and distribute. This, of course, has its own logic. These policies in English, which are progressive, because of course they focus more on those that are those that have less resources, those that of course talk about are of course controlled by the huge enterprises, by the bourgeoisie. So of course the very same they can be closer to the collective rather than other policies could be more oriented towards the interests of the Latinx. In a third thematic axis is typical of the sociological tradition and is related to the complex and double relationship between the school system and the social structure. I say double because on the one hand, it is necessary to understand what extent the position that students and their families have in the social space somehow explains not only their school career, but also their learning results. But at the same time, it is necessary to complement this analysis with the recognition of the effects that the school experience and the degrees obtained have on the very configuration of the social structure. So there's a moment when the school system, of course, depends on what happens in other spaces of society. While it is important to acknowledge that what that educational system has implications on this configuration.
Por otra parte, estas relaciones necesitan ser
On the other hand, these relationships need to be understood both from the point of view of the structural and objective relationships that are manifested through associations between social and school variables, as well as from the point of view of the meanings and strategies put into practice by, of course, apprenticeships, by the families, the place of residence, and of course, school performance. These are objective relationships and structural. We don't have certain actors that intervene. We don't need to question these different actors about their methods. There are many many studies that talk about the system of social reproduction strategies that aim to improve the position that individuals and groups have in social spaces, etc. Here, what school does is a variation of social factors, but we also have to acknowledge that we do have relationships that we need to study, that we need to research, that have to do with practice of these social actors, the strategies of these families and students, or of the educational actors as managers of these learning centers and their results. The book, of course, there's a part in the book which is a construction which talks about subjects and agents, strategies, expectations, interests, and different desires, which of course determine practices. In the book, of course, I consider it relevant to discuss what sense we can consider certain knowledge as capital, so that we can look at the reproduction of social production, which has an object to continue or improve the situation of these individuals in the space. So of course, a very concrete example of how we need to look at things socially from the point of view, if we look at the fact that where do I send my child? How long will he learn? How long will he go to school? All of this, all of these worries that have to deal with your child's education is not an element that is sort of not important in society. There are other things that also underscore this. Of course, sanitary situations, to have the child get vaccinated, to have him eat healthfully. This has to do with, of course, with physical health as well, which also talks about social reproduction, because every group, every individual looks to improve or maintain its social situation, matrimonial situations, all of their family structure. These initiatives, of course, can denominate social reproduction. From the point of view, what families do with respect to school has a lot to do with what they do in other social plans, because all these strategies have to do with social mobility. So the object, the strategy, the educational strategy is very important when it's in relationship with other practices that have the same end result. The structures and the institutions that we have are a result that has been objectified by several forces. So it's not a coincidence, but they do have the capacity of determining the practices and the strategies. So the social actors don't act for them. We are determined by norms, by resources that are objective structures. These are institutions. No agent, no social agent acts in isolation. We all work in several contexts. That means that these institutions with rules and resources have the capacity to determine practices and strategies of the social actors, which of course can contribute to reproduce these institutions or to transform them. There is no coincidence here, but of course, we need to understand that there are no free subjects, autonomous, that are simple conscience and volition, that this desire or this liberty that they have, that we have to have within quotes, is conditioned, but is not completely determined. There are no coincidences. Everything had an origin and it can have an end. These social situations that determine in the reality are the results of these results that have been developed in historic moments. So of course, they can also vary and they can change. In this, with this issue, we can also talk about certain capital, richness that produces capital. This capital, along with economic capital, are the main determinants. We have political capital, social capital, and of course, social acknowledgement. These are the main ones. These are the main determinants that will determine people's situation and the groups that have and what they have in society. Economic capital and political capital. Again, I repeat that. These are the bases for these societies. The fact that cultural capital has a very prominent point in the social space. From this point of view, the appropriation of knowledge is of a social matter because it contributes to creating the configuration of society, to explain the definition, the redistribution of our society. In this sense, it is in this sense that we consider it important to talk about knowledge, powerful knowledge, during the last few years, which have been talked about by the English sociologist Michael Young, in the understanding that not all knowledge and cultures socially have the same value of performative power. Not all knowledge has the same capacity to do the very same thing. And I maintain that all languages, for example, have the same dignity and also have something valuable to contribute to universal culture. But not all of them provide access to the most powerful knowledge, such as the most complex scientific, technological ones, right? The ones that are the most complex. I'd like to give you an example. For example, English is as important as all the other languages, but Guarani, for example, doesn't have the same power, performative power that Spanish has or that English has. And this is really important. I'm convinced that the best contribution that the school has, all of these members have the right to appropriate themselves of this, the most complex way of using this type of capital, right? And of course, this knowledge requires a specialized institution whose appropriation requires intervention of proper educational establishments and people that are specialized in these areas. In fact, I'm convinced that the best contribution that the school can make to the construction of a less unequal society is by developing powerful knowledge in the majority of the members of the new generations of Latin Americans. And for this, we must question the relevance of old devices such as the classifying and hierarchical evaluation and the critical review of the logic of meritocracy based on the ideology of natural gifts and effort. These traditional devices that have become naturalized in extremely unequal societies that have been in existence for centuries now are no longer legitimate in this society and no longer legitimize school and social inequalities. Meritocracy has no sense in societies where the majority of the strategic resources are more and more concentrated for a certain group. The persistence, in fact, I think it's very important to discuss the issue of meritocracy because it is what allows us to explain that within these inequalities that are public, that are not hidden, in fact, are shown. And it's impressive how this concentration of wealth is in the hands of a few people, even when we're going through social crises, economic crises, health crises, the likes of which we've lived in the last few years. But there are more and more people that are richer. This concentration of wealth that I would even dare to say obscene, they provoke no sort of social mobility. In fact, it just promotes all types of criticism, but it doesn't really promote any type of social mobility. So then the question is, sociologically, how is it that we can explain this right, this such an important right? We explained this because of the predominant importance of the meritocracy, which has incorporated itself in several layers of society, which allows to create all these realities that are objective into inequalities. This is another theme that I believe that we need to talk about and we need to approach, and is at the heart of egalitarian education. Another theme that I developed in my book concerns the teaching issue. It's a very old topic that I'm really interested in from when I was still in Mexico. I actually started learning about this when the educational system, the modern educational system, was in its origins. I would say that the contemporary educational policy is an apparatus that still has not consolidated itself. It has not gotten to be an authentic learning machine and has not yet been consolidated. The first apprenticeship still needs the mediation of an institution and specialized agents, right? In my book, I argue that what teachers do, that is, their practices and strategies, professional ones, not only obey their knowledge and value orientations, but like all social agents, their practices require objective resources that we call institutions. That is, a set of rules, resources ranging from the physical infrastructure of the school, organizational models, teaching technologies, school regulatory systems, etc. Therefore, quote, what happens in the classroom, close quote, is not explained only by subjective factors related to the teachers. I'll repeat that again. Their training, their values, many times this is forgotten. And there is a tendency to impute to the teachers all the responsibility for the results in terms of learning of their students. For this reason, the suspicion about the school ends up becoming, in many cases, a suspicion about the teachers. And let's say they are the backbone of the educational system, and especially about the unionized teachers of public education. And this is particularly true in the accounts of certain technocratic agents who are unable to articulate subjective and objective factors in the explanation of social practices and processes. In turn, the unions that represent the corporate interests of teachers tend to emphasize the importance of structural factors, basically financial ones, and as the dominant explanatory factor for the low level of quality of learning that is actually developed. Only an adequate theory of social practices can overcome this dualism that hinders understanding and overcoming the problems of contemporary basic education in most of the countries of the region. Finally, in the book, I include a chapter that I wrote in the heat of the impacts of pandemic on school routines. In synthetic terms, I maintain that the pandemic has only accentuated social inequalities and inequalities in terms of schooling and learning of powerful knowledge, which of course existed already, which tend to be concentrated in the dominant social sectors. That is, all of these capitals are concentrated in the main areas. That is, in the urban bourgeoisie, to the detriment of groups socially dominated from the countryside and the city. Faced with this educational catastrophe, only possible scenarios can be built. The first, of course, there are several propositions that I mentioned in the book, and the first is the conservative restorative scenario. The second is that everything goes back to normal. The schools are there, the teachers are there, the rules are there, the financing is there. Again, of the commotion created by the closing of schools, many distinguished colleagues, like a Spanish sociologist, and of course I don't remember his name now, Marino Fernandez, he said that school will never be the same again, as though this was a coup d'etat against the school system that made it shake to its very foundations. I've always appreciated or never ignored the inertia. Schools have gone through many things, wars, catastrophe, many types of vicissitudes, but when these critical circumstances are over, that the social inertia around this, which is incorporated in subjectivity, allows this to go back to normal. So of course, the first scenario is a conservative restorative scenario. That's what I mentioned. I didn't want to, I wanted to use that. And again, it's a possible scenario. I don't want to say that it's the most desired, because again, I'm a critic of this. And I would have preferred that the impact of the pandemic would have allowed us to think of these old systems so that we can rethink them and improve them. And of course, the second one is a movement of transformation, which I call technocratic mercantilistic. And of course, I'm not going to describe it. It's in the book. There's a very good description of it, of what this consists. The power of mercantilism, the power of politics, all of the elements that were introduced, etc. And the very third one is the one that I call the egalitarian humanist one, which is, of course, has to deal with in the book, I only describe these scenarios that constitute two true political projects to struggle on. These are three scenarios that are, of course, growing in the political arena, educational arena. They are also in conflict. And I guess the only thing that we could say from one of the political groups is that there will be lots of fights, but we can't understand what the outcome will be. Not yet. And of course, the only thing the evidence allows us to point out who are the carriers interested in these projects and what arguments they use and what resources they are capable. In closing, I would like to share with you some of the themes. And of course, I belong to this tradition. And of course, I belong to this field. I don't want it to be prescriptive. And of course, where sociology was born, of course. It leaves its mark in Marx, in Burken and Berven, and as well, and of course in French sociology, with the distinguished 20th century European sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. These, of course, are the sources which inspire me in the language of sociology. The first thing I want to make explicit are the differences, because of course it's very rich, are the differences between sociological and pedagogical discourse. So it's very important to have this in mind, because the pedagogical discourse tends to dominate in the educational sciences. The second tradition is strongly prescriptive and has a strong weight I repeat, in the field of educational sciences in Latin America. In fact, Durkheim observed that pedagogues were critical and eminently reformist spirits. And of course, they were critical of their education. And their main concern was to propose ideal school systems that would overcome the limitations of actually existing systems.
Emilio,
That was their worry.
perdona que te corte, pero bueno, nada
I'm so
más
sorry, Emilio, but it's just to, yes, we're at the very end. With this prescriptive relationship, of course, sociology becomes an external object. It is a discipline that has an external object about which people have to ask questions. The truths or the products of these sociological results are a synthesis, a language which is relatively coherent, because of course, for me, theory is a type of language. It's the type of language that we use. And at the very same time, we have this relationship between the language and the evidences that are shown. The relationships between language and coherence empirically is the key for success, for the creation of information in sociology, which contributes to why things are the way they are, why things are reproduced, why these things are recreated, and why do we condemn them at times, and why we reproduce routines which allow us to present or introduce changes, reforms. I think that reforms, the most ambitious ones in Latin America, have failed because they have not explained why things are the way they are. And I think that would be the best contribution that ecology, sociology, economy would be able to make to the educational field in order to produce a better or transformative educational system in Latin America. Thank you so very much, Romina. Thank you very much for reminding me about the time constraints.
Gracias a ti, Emilio, por
Thank you
favor.
so very much. Thank you so very much.
Ahora le doy la palabra a Pablo.
Okay, perfect. So
¿Verdad?
now we will turn it over to Pablo.
Hola a todos, hola a todas. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Hello, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you're able to hear me. So truthfully, I'd like to share a little bit more on this topic. I'd like to thank Ilas and all of my colleagues, and again, my colleagues as well. When the book arrived and I started reading it, I started thinking more about educational history and the politics behind. So of course, it sort of took me back 8 universes in the past, and I remembered Emilio, that of course, when I saw him at the university in Mexico, I remember finding this book or running across this book, which was really important, The Art of a Good Teacher. I was doing my master's and I was hiding in one of the areas reading this in a huge library, and I found it. I had heard about this book before. It was very useful to me, I have to say. And then a point of departure for the book is what we're talking about today. The fact that this book was published during the 90s, it was very important. And as we said, the School Under Suspicion is a restructure of, there's an oxymoron, of course, here, a school, which was not something very common with its traditions. And of course, it places this idea of possible criticism in the book against school. We can talk about the panegyric, laudatory traditions, where we want to be more critical. And of course, it's wonderful to talk about the tragedies involved in all of this. But of course, please let me know what you would think would be one of the most important traditions to come from this book in the Argentine society. But truthfully, in the academic world, people consider it to be an embarrassment what happened with the educational system. So I believe that, yes, this culture that we mentioned in the book are worthy, are, of course, worthy of translating what we would consider rage or indignation. If we look, upon looking at this book today, it sort of moves from, there are two registers in the book. The book does not stop being a manual of pedagogy for education. We can see the index. The table of contents goes over several topics. But of course, we talk about the power of state, power of participation, and I'm so sorry to the experts here, but I think that the focus here is on the main question of sociology of education. If we look at Durkheim, the one that Emilio mentioned, that could have some sort of repercussion. What is the question that we have from social structures and educational systems? And of course, this celebrates what the book is doing. And by being a manual, you know, it's a wonderful guide for people today. And I say as a manual, because it's a common point that we have, a common denominator that Emilio mentioned. But I guess it would also help to create dialogue for other cultures. If we look, for example, at English education, and for other systems in the United States, and I say it's a very good manual, but we don't call it sociology of education. We call it a manual of education. There's sort of a manifesto in here. There's a type of tradition in this book. And of course, this comes from a very long line. The fact that I say this, I say that, the presence of the authors, as Emilio said, there's no intent of having objectivity. I believe that we have to look at statistics. We need to look at other information. We need to look at other data. And of course, for the technocrats involved, Emilio, when he writes at the very beginning, he says that it's a tradition connected to research, that it's a manual, that it's functional. And he manifests this and he takes a position. And as a last comment for this, I would like to thank, I would say it's very important. When we talk about the pandemic, in the last chapter, it says that we have new scenarios. At the very end, these three scenarios that show up. And at one point, Emilio said, or used the words, at the beginning of the book, Emilio says that, or raises the point that in the 21st century, he mentions the meritocracy. And I believe that in one of the chapters, this debate that is the great debate of the 20th century about rights, where we see all of these phenomena in Latin American society over rights, but again, also mercantilism in the 21st century. So I think that what Emilio is trying to do is to show all these inequalities. It shows the contradiction that we have in society, but there is a social question that's very important. What is an inequality? What is the distance between the issues? And I believe that this is where Emilio makes a certain point. There's a certain nostalgic and melancholic tradition that I think we've all gone through.
Hablando de Bourdieu sin saber Bourdieu, ¿no? Pero en cierta forma, en el debate entre relaciones de
And
estructura
of course,
social,
speaking in a certain way, by looking at different social structures, I think that the problematic that we have in society with the distribution of social capitalism, we are proposing what would be the correct way between the different distinctions, the different distributions. We have a position, of course, that would be the rich shall be rich, the poor shall be poor. And of course, education worked. And I guess we also have to see how we can stop subordinating the educational system and the economic system. And then what are the practices that within the system, the educational system, what changes can we make to the economic system? Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Emilio, I will see you around. And thank you so very much for the information you put forth in the book.
Gracias, gracias.
Gracias, Pablo. Por favor, Regina.
Thank you so very much, Regina. So firstly, thank you very much, Emilio. And thank you also for sending me the book, for sending us the book so that we could read it. And I'm going to be very brief because I would like to let people ask questions.
El libro, y bueno, ya habló Emilio.
The book, well, Emilio already spoke about theory, the sociological theory, theory of sociology of education, what is in the book, and it was very well written, and it's extremely reader friendly. And of course, School Under Suspicion is a reflection over things that are happening now, not only in Argentina, but all over the world, because we are talking about the school that is being evaluated as the evaluator, not a school that is simply based on data, liberalism and its effect on public school systems. And it's very interesting how this relationship is built between school and education, as Emilio mentioned. And of course, the state that is interested in social equality, and the state that at the same time is witnessing the growth of mercantilism. The paragraphs that speak of the teaching state or the educational state are very interesting. Everything that we know about the state in its creation of citizenry is where we also see the intervention of the market, and of course recent autonomy that public schools have at the moment, and many other actors as well, private actors within public education, is a topic that is very interesting to Emilio, for example. I focused on 2 points that I thought were very interesting, truthfully, because of how current they are. One of them is a conversation that he has between the relationship between school that exists currently, the traditional school system, and the continuing situation with the youth in marginalized areas, where traditional school doesn't offer them any response. So we have all of Latin America, where we call the niñas, that don't go to school, don't work. And one very important thing is that school is not responding to this. And I think it's very important what Emilio speaks or mentions, how school has to sort of adjust to the culture of this youth, instead of saying that the youth has to adjust to school. I think that was extremely interesting, a very pertinent point that Emilio raises. And I think there's a lot to think of regarding this issue in all of Latin America. I also think that, I also believe that his reflection over the very rapid changes that occurred during the pandemic is also extremely interesting, because he says that the response to many countries was technology. But technology has also made us ask ourselves certain things. And 2 questions that are, I believe, very pertinent at the moment are, if we can learn better in school, or if we can actually learn equally as well outside of school by way of technology. And I think that we have to make some sort of empiric research on this, because truthfully, I was very happy to go back to in-person learning, because I think they're more efficient as a teacher, so that I can connect with students. But I think it is a very valid point. The other question is whether or not the role of school as a social apparatus has changed because of technology, because of social media, because of everything that's happening. I guess it would be very important to continue thinking on what school's role is as a socializing factor in society. I think that there are very many important ideas that are mentioned in the book with regards to this issue. And Emilio also talks about the tension in the book that exists as a public good, for example. And of course, regarding teaching by way of technology, he believes that in order to achieve more equal education, and this is again something he underscores a lot, egalitarian education in the book, it is very important to speak about pedagogy, pedagogy of equality. He mentions very important topics, and I would love to talk a little bit more about that with Emilio some other time. But I do believe that this pedagogy of equality is an extremely important idea. And the fact that we need more technology, but more humanity on the part of the teachers, who, of course, should be supported by technology in their efforts. And he then goes on to speak about how school, in its public and social role, has been affected by all of the different capitals. He did mention the family capital, the inversion of parents, and the fact that this has all created some sort of competition outside of the school, and that is not supporting a school of equality. And one of the things that I really enjoyed were the chapters in which he focused on the role of the teachers, because the teachers, of course, are always blamed for what's happening in schools. But how are we going to support these pedagogues, these teachers, so that we can reach this egalitarian education? And it's one of the cornerstones of the book. And of course, many reflections, very many important reflections. And I really appreciate Emilio for all of these contributions. But like I said, I will be very brief so that we can have at least for one or two questions from the audience. Thank you so very much, Emilio. And I do recommend that you read this book. It's an amazing book, and it's very well written, and topics that are very related to our day-to-day. Thank you. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Regina, por
Thank you so very
Pablo,
much,
también por tus
Regina and
comentarios.
Pablo, for your comments.
Bueno, abrimos a preguntas.
So, questions? Any questions?
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
Does anyone have any questions?
A ver, sí, me está llegando una pregunta. A ver, dice, Emilio, la plática
Yes, let's see. Emilio, the conversation
que,
suggests that since different social sectors expect different things from
esta se ha
school,
tenido que someter a una serie de
this has had
demandas
to subject itself to a
insatisfechas.
series of
¿Cuál es la
demands,
salida para
unsatisfying
tal
demands.
encrucijada?
What is the answer so that we can get out of this very difficult situation? Well, I did say that, you know, more and more is asked of schools, right? I think it would also be good to have someone like Pablo as a historian. When we read and analyze all of the conversations of the second half of the 19th century in Mexico, what was expected of school? There were very many things that were expected, but they were simple. You know, we had to transform the inhabitants of this territory that was very heterogeneous in terms of language. And imagine that all the different types of ethnicities in Mexico in the 19th century, and transform them into a Mexican citizen. We had to create at least a common denominator. The the imposition of a common language so that they could all understand each other. Spanish was the language that was picked. And from that very moment, when the state officialized, because of course the state has this right, this power of officializing a language, all of the other languages became were relegated to the second category. But a language, a conscience of this of the space. Where do we learn in Argentina? Where did Mexicans learn or Argentinians learn that beyond their small communities in the mountains, there in Oaxaca, we have Mexico. So geography was very important. So language, geography, history, all of these events that took place, this common memory and elements, and mathematics, of course. That is what school was for, to take the citizen and have him or her learn, and the 4 basic operations. That's what school was for. This relative simplicity, which was, of course, these were very shared objectives. I'm an immigrant. I lived from this. I came from Italy to Argentina when I was 4. I went to school in Argentina, and in school, it was a factory of Argentinians. I learned the language, I learned the geography, the map, the history, and that was it. And I learned how to read and write. That's what I learned in school. That's what I learned in compulsory education. That's what my mom expected. That's what my mother and father expected. And that's what school offered me. So teachers knew what they were there for. Families knew what they were there for, why they sent them to school. Today, we need to look at the objectives of school. We need to look at the curricula. All of this, the knowledge has been diversified. The disciplines, we have to teach values. We have to teach healthy eating habits. We have to teach talk about health and obesity. All of the cardiological practices. We have to learn them how to deal with urban spaces, how to drive. They have to learn. We have to create these citizens that are not delinquents. We have to teach them how to learn language, cultural sensitivity, math. I mean, it's so much that we have to teach, all these universal truths, locally and nationally and internationally. Every single month, I think that parliaments in Argentina come up with a new representative who say, now we have to do this. In Mendoza, we have to add this to the history of wine. How can you be from Mendoza and not know about wine? How do you not know the difference between a Cabernet and a Malbec, for example? So the curriculum in these schools has so much. It's overcharged. It has so much. And I have the impression that school does not exist right now in the moment to react to these things. Of course, then we have disappointment. After this, right? You have to train for school. Then, of course, school goes to school, they get a diploma, and they have no work. And then, of course, we always have ministers here in Argentina that will talk about unemployment because of school. People are unemployed. People were not able to work because schools had not developed their competencies. So why do people get sick? Because of school, because they didn't learn how to take care of their health. They didn't learn how to eat, right? So do we have traffic accidents, right? Because of course, schools did not teach them the laws, right? School is a savior. School is responsible for everything, for work, for the economy. And politicians love this discourse because they know that school is a numerous world. It's a huge world. We know that there are millions of teachers in Mexico, millions of teachers in Argentina that live with families that have such a huge populace. So school is the heart of politics. As Tony Blair said when they asked him about one of the campaigns, his program, his very famous sentence that I hear someone say it: I have 3 things to propose English people: education, education, and education. And they keep repeating this. This is what politicians keep saying this, and especially in the third world, in moments of elections. But then when schools or teaching grows, in Europe, for example, the levels of students that have left schools are huge. But of course, we have issues on the street, we have delinquency, we have disease, and all of this is school is to blame. School is to blame for everything that happens in society. So this, of course, all contributes to the suspicion about schools, the criticism of schools. So the question we have, and I think we need to look at this as a society, what do schools exist for? I still believe I still keep thinking that education is important. I'm not talking about the university. I'm not talking about colleges. There are many colleagues that talk about that. I care about general education. The question is, what is it that we have to do once school has ended, when someone has finished high school? Because here in school, students go all the way up to 18. What is it that a youth has to do? What do they have to do and learn from school? What is that knowledge, powerful knowledge, fundamental knowledge that they all have the right to learn? And I have an answer for that. For example, to teach values, many say, no, schools do not have the monopoly on values. That's what mass communication teaches. Parents, even if they are illiterate. My father went to school until 3rd grade. He was able to teach me the value of honesty, of not lying, of to following through on my commitments, to be responsible. Someone who is illiterate can teach you values and has taught me and did teach me values. They couldn't teach me math or teach me how to read and write. They couldn't teach me history or physics. So the question is, what is important for the development of people in society that only an institution like school can do? That's the focus that I leave here for you. Things that other institutions can do that can actually do it even better than schools. For example, the development of good eating habits showed up the other day. In fact, in Italy, someone was proposing that we need to teach in school curriculum, healthy eating. But how is it that schools are able to teach more than all the capitalistic ads that we have, so that they can teach new generations eating habits? Have you ever seen a child in front of a TV? All of the ads that are on TV, so that they eat candy that are addictive. We don't even know what they're eating, right? What is it that a poor teacher in a public school can do with her limited resources and persuade children not to do that? More so than these ads. Of course, we are interested in developing these healthy eating habits, but we then have to regulate the capitalistic ads. Let's not put it in the curriculum, in school curriculum, because if we keep adding all this, the more we add, we're going to sink schools. I'm looking at this as a sociologist. I have no authority to say this, of course. I have the authority as a sociologist to say that so much content is impossible to develop with our current resources. In fact, there was research done in Argentina during the first evaluation that was done in '92. There was a survey of teachers that was done, and they asked them, what percentage of the curricula were you able to develop by the end of the school year? And I think that the average was about 60%. The question was an open question. What percentage of the content that is in school curricula were you able to teach? 60%. And that was a normal year. Can you imagine now, after the pandemic, with reduced time, what percentage of the content of this curriculum were teachers able to teach? That of course was something that affected teachers. So now teachers have to double back and say, well, what is more important? Of course, these are collective topics of debate, more than what we see in curricula. What is most important, right? For me, there are two things.
Emilio,
The
muchas
development.
gracias. Perdona que te corte otra vez.
I'm so sorry
No,
to
es que estamos
interrupt,
todos muy
Emilio.
picados con
But
tu
I mean,
plática, la verdad.
it's amazing.
No
The
sé,
conversation is amazing. But
algunos ya se tienen que ir porque ya estamos
I know that some people have
pasadas
to leave
las
because
4:30.
we are past 4:30.
Pero bueno, si nos hicieras el favor de tomar 2
But if
preguntas
you
más,
could take 2 more questions.
estaría muy bien. Muchas gracias. Entonces,
Thank you so much.
aquí tenemos, voy a leer
So
una
here we
del chat
have
y después le voy a
one
pasar
from the chat,
la palabra a Felicitas.
and then I'm going to have Felicitas speak.
Dice, en
And
Argentina,
it
tal
says,
como en muchos
in Argentina, as
países
such,
donde opera el
as in
capitalismo,
many
el
countries where we have
sistema ha
capitalism,
marginalizado a
the
ciertos
system has
sectores sociales
marginalized
que carecen de
certain social
oportunidades
sectors that
académicas
lack
y
academic
subsecuentemente
opportunities, and
oportunidades
subsequently
profesionales. Emilio, en
opportunities,
su
conventional
opinión, ¿qué medidas
opportunities.
podrían tomarse para
In
minimizar
your
esta
opinion, what
disparidad
measures can
social
we take
entre
to
sectores
minimize
socioeconómicos respecto
this
de la
lack
educación?
of opportunities in these sectors with
Y,
respect to
por favor,
education?
Felicitas.
Felicitas, if you could respond. Thank you so much. Such an amazing opportunity. Hi, Emilio, how are you? Yes, this is my partner here. So I think that I just wanted to know what your reaction was. I was riveted by the last part of your presentation, where you talk about the social discourse and the pedagogical discourse. If I understood correctly, of a bigger relationship with the empirical proofs and the contributions of language contributions, scientific contributions. I don't believe that this is present because, of course, a few days ago, there was I attended a conference about the I'm sorry, who was it that was at the Congress? I'm sorry, I don't know her. It was at Columbia University, but I believe I just wanted to see if this resonated with you because truthfully, the point was the proofs that we took from the empirical studies is not necessarily the truth. It's an institutional construction which is based on trainings, and what she was talking about, which of course worries me a little bit when I think about reforms and educational policies. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about how we use this proof with the actors from academia, if they are the decision makers, and to base the policies on these proofs, which is based on the investigation, which reduces the amount of problems. There are new actors that perform as mediators, as brokers, as mediators for this production of rules. So what is your perspective? What is your sociological perspective? How does this resonate with you? This warning with respect to the weight that we give to proof. Thank you. No, thank you. So before we finish off, I just wanted to thank, of course, all of my colleagues' interventions, and Pablo, with the effort that they took in commenting on my book, with, of course, all of their poignant remarks. Thank you so very much. This conversation should continue in better conditions, perhaps with a nice glass of wine in a bar. So that, but of course, this is better than nothing, right? But there are other ways, of course, that can allow us to expound upon this and communicate in a richer way. But thank you as well to Felicitas and to the other person that asked the question. Capitalistic social societies are unequal. In order for there to be equal teaching, we have to act upon the social conditions and the pedagogical conditions. We can't just focus on one versus the other. One of my friends, Juan Tedesco, he would always say that one of his biggest worries was the contribution that you were to add at school or do at school was to create a more just society. But now we need a more equal society so that school can actually do its work. How much equality do we need so that school can actually have educational results, better results? So we need to work within the current conditions and pedagogical conditions. But of course, from the Ministry of Education, we cannot just speak, even when schools, of course, feed people, they provide students with scholarships, they continue providing them with basic needs, which would, of course, be the object of other policies, more social economic policies. But of course, I think that the most important. But now that we're talking about the state, I think this was a debate that we began in Mexico with a group of colleagues, and I believe there were some Argentines involved. There was a seminar that we had in educational theory and the relationship that we have between pedagogy and sociology. And I say this because we have these disciplines have an object. Their main worry is to talk about reality with data, with theories, and of course more data with data. I'm one of the kind that believes that sociology supposes coherence and of course empiric proof. Pedagogues don't really care for understanding education too much. They do criticize education for the present, and they do sort of try to create these ideal situations. I'll give you an example. When we put together the research at UNESCO over teachers in 2000, when you look in the internet, what we know about teachers in the moment, 95% of the articles that we had in Google were all speeches about how the teacher should be. How should the teacher be trained? What should the teacher know? What attitudes should he adopt? And we don't really know how teachers are. In Argentina in 2000, not even the state knew how many teachers there were in the country. So there's this deep appreciation of what teachers are and what they should know. These are the characteristics. is of course, a bias of the pedagogical tradition. This is something that goes all the way to Freire. If you read all of Freire's books, you might have an idea of how Brazilian education is, what the level of illiteracy is, how the teaching apparatus, of course, evolved. But we're not going to find that in the text because that was not his worry. He was a critic of school, and he wanted to launch pedagogies, ideal teachers. This is a prescriptive discourse. The others that are scientific disciplines, the main interest that the sociologist and an economist, a historian has is to show the reality by using certain language, tools that have accumulated along history for these disciplines. I believe it's not enough to transform this indignation, what we believe is inappropriate, but also ideal schools, ideal teachers. We need to understand why school is this way. Why is it that because of all of these ideals, our teachers continue teaching? They have to stand in front of a group of teachers, and when we ask them, what do? I teach. They say, I teach. Even the language in practice has nothing to do with the discourse. It's how it should be. But then what we should do is ask, why is it the teachers continue teaching, which is a practice that everyone criticizes. The teacher doesn't know everything, that students are not an empty vessel. The teachers should create. So this is how schools are evaluated then. What type of evaluations are done in schools? History professors, for example, math teachers do it with the same frequency. We don't know. There's so many discourses. It should be formative. It's tradition. It's notorious. I'm also indignant because of all these injustices. And I also agree with the progressive, centralist pedagogy. I also agree. But we need to explain this so that we can transform it. This is the deficit that we have on the side of knowledge. And I'll actually mention one more thing. Against the famous evidence-based policy. This is all technocracy. This does not exist. Politics are politics, policies are policies. It's dialogue, it's articulation, it's exchange. There are no policies. If we want theory-based policies, we would have to close this talk, this conversation. We would have to let the scientists discuss this. We need to analyze all of the research that, of course, talks about the best way, all these technocrats, and they evaluate study all the evaluations and the best programs. That has to be centered in school, that has to be individualized. I am completely against these kinds of policies, evidence-based policies.
Sí. Te tengo que cortar otra vez, pero bueno, estamos todos súper contentos de tenerte aquí, Pablo. Muchas
Amelia,
gracias
I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, interrupt one more time.
Regina
thank you so very much,
tuvo
Pablo,
que
for having me
retirarse,
here.
pero también muchas gracias a ellos, a todos
Regina had to
los
leave, but thank you
asistentes,
so very much.
al
The
intérprete, por favor,
assistants,
muchísimas gracias por
for the
estos minutos
interpreter,
extra,
thank you
y
so
al
very
equipo
much for
de
these extra
ILAS,
minutes, and
que nos
for
ayudó a
the
organizar todo esto.
team at
Muchas
ILAS that
gracias a
helped us to
todos,
organize all of this.
y
Thank
bueno,
you so very much.
estamos en contacto para la
We will
plática
be
que se
in
viene, la
touch
presentación del libro que se viene,
for
para más
the
noticias
next
acerca de
presentation
esta, y que se subirá el
that we
video
will have,
al YouTube de ILAS.
and
Muchas gracias a todos.
the video for which we will
Y pues hasta la
put a video
próxima.
on YouTube very
Buena
soon.
tarde.
Thank you so much. We will see